Yugoslavia, a country that existed throughout most of the 20th century, that came into existence swiftly and just as rapidly went out of it. It is a nation shrouded in mystery. To some, it was a land of opportunity and promise, while to others, a state of oppression and terror. But its real story is much more complex and convoluted. And so I present to you the history of Yugoslavia. Since the establishment of feudalism in Europe, the Balkans in large have been settled by the Slavs. Since their arrival to the accursed Bermuda Triangle of Europe, where hopes, dreams, and carburetors go to die, the Slavic peoples became a prominent ethnic group all over these lands. Most prominently, you could find them in today's Western and Eastern Balkans, but large communities existed in modern-day Greece, Hungary, and Romania as well. But although their presence has been a stable phenomenon since essentially forever, the same cannot be said for their identity. You see, much like a girlie suffering from BPD, Balkan Slavs alongside, well, practically everyone in that time period, didn't really have a proper definition of who they were. Sure, your Ivans and Vladimirs knew their names, their entire lineage, the lord whose lands they worked on and who ripped them off via taxes, but who and what were they exactly? Hell no. For the vast majority of history, the way we look at ethnicity and nationality didn't really exist. To cut a long story short, Slavs in the Balkans didn't really see themselves as a distinct ethnic group. Hell, they mostly saw themselves as Christians, and in a multicultural, Soros-enriched environment, that was the Ottoman Empire, that was the main distinction. The only distinction that mattered was whether or not you were Muslim. Hence why, several centuries prior, Greeks, Romanians, and Slavs thought of themselves as the same people, despite speaking vastly different languages. But as our understanding of history, anthropology, and linguistics evolved, this line of thinking slowly started to be left in the dust, and new ideas of ethnic identity started to take the spotlight all over the world, and especially in the Balkans. As nationalism was slowly starting to grasp the intrigue of Europeans in the early 19th century, the Balkans, after centuries of foreign rule and occupation, started to be intrigued in particular. This culminated in a large chunk of Slavs starting to realize, hey, wait a second, we're not all the same. My village speaks normally, while those guys across the Danube speak something more akin to duck quacks. Ahó, sziasztok, srácok! Én István vagyok. Hogy vagytok? Milyen szép nap van ma? And so, by the 1830s, this view of Slavic distinction from the others culminated into the Illyrian movement. Founded by a Croat, Ljudevit Guy, the movement intended to acquire recognition for Southern Slavic cultural rights within the Austrian Empire for the Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs. Although at the time, they thought of themselves as Illyrians, but, you know, let the kids LARP. As you can imagine, the inbreds known as the Habsburgs didn't really like this new attitude of their South Slavic subjects, and their pleas fell on deaf ears. This snubbing and continuous attempts of erasing the South Slavic identity via programs of Germanization and Magyarization only fueled the flames of this new national awakening, and more radical movements started popping up. This wasn't unique only to the Slavs. The Hungarians at the time were also undergoing their own wave of national awakening and nationalistic tendencies that too was causing quite the headache for the Austrians. In an attempt to subdue this ruckus radiating from Hungary, the Austrians decided to concede to some of their demands and establish the dual monarchy known as Austria-Hungary, where Hungary would have enormous amounts of autonomy and self-determination rights. Although this fact is well known about today, what isn't known about it is that at the same time, the Slavs within the empire were also proposing that the monarchy be split into three, with the southern Slavs having their own kingdom under the Austrian emperor. Ultimately, this notion was rejected and national tensions continued to simmer. Now, one important thing to note is that this idea of Slavic nationalism and what we know and define today as Southern pan-slavism was initially primarily centered in the Slavic realms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As Serbia and Bulgaria practically got independence a bit prior, their peoples couldn't care less about some grand unifying Slavic state. They shed enough blood fighting for the establishment of their own nation state, and they'd be damned if they were about to be grouped together with with some other dumbasses just so they could lose their sense of self all over again. So, ironically enough, the Croats were the primary group pushing for this ideology. But real quick, if you'd like to stay relevant and become a content creator yourself, you can check out InVideo AI. In an ever more digitizing world, content creation has become an ever more viable way of securing that bag and the future. But creating videos from scratch without the necessary skills, time, or resources can be challenging. But InVideo AI is there to solve just that, as irrespective of your skill level, with them you can generate your own AI videos perfect for any theme. Just write in any prompt, as ridiculous as it is, and in minutes you'll get a masterpiece.
As Mecca Ottoman Janissaries threaten the ancient Hagia Sophia, a desperate search begins. In a crowd of ordinary men, a divine light shines upon Georg, marking him as the chosen one.
From there on, you can bring your video to perfection by editing it via simple text-based commands like changing the intro to start with a joke, adding your own voice, translating it into Romanian, or just straight out editing the actual footage. And if you want to make some more serious stuff too, InVideo AI will do all the heavy lifting. So you too can enter the Instagram Reels, YouTube, or TikTok market and make yourself cold hard passive income. So don't waste any time. Click on my link in the description and try it out for free. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. By the beginning of the 20th century, these ethnic tensions went from a simmer to a boil when a Bosnian Serb shot the Austro-Hungarian Archduke and the world went up in flames as empires crashed and burned. Although prior to this point, the Slavs living within the empire were mainly pushing for internal reforms that would grant them cultural and linguistic rights, in 1915 this went out the window and secession from Austria-Hungary became the hot new thing on the block. In the early stages of the war, a prominent Croatian lawyer known as Ante Trumbic traveled to Italy where he founded the Yugoslav Committee, a political organization that aimed to unify all Southern Slavs into one singular state. At the same time, a Slovenian priest, Anton Kurešec, founded the Yugoslav Club in Slovenia, which practically had the same idea as the Yugoslav Committee in Italy. Upon their establishment, the two would go on a lobbying mission throughout the West to raise awareness and support for their cause, which quickly caught the attention of the Allies. The notion of an independent Southern Slavic state only grew larger by 1917, when Trumbic successfully made an agreement with the exiled Serbian government, which was quite the big deal, as Serbia, as I mentioned before, wasn't really all that for a Frankenstein Slavic state, and instead wished for the expansion of the independent Serbian kingdom. As the war was coming to an end and the tides were switching on the Balkan front, as Serbia and the Allies were pushing its way deeper into Austro-Hungarian territory, a Yugoslav state seemed to be just on the horizon. As such, Trumbic and Kurešec both rushed to Zagreb, where together they formed the first ever Yugoslav government. Not long after that, its headquarters were switched to Belgrade as the Allies only continued pummeling the disorganized Austro-Hungarian army. Finally, 1 month after the end of the war to end all wars, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was proclaimed in Belgrade on December 1st, 1918, with the Serbian king, Petar I Karađorđević, at the helm of the state. The founding of a pan-Slavic southern kingdom brought a wave of hope and optimism for what the future held in store. The southern Slavs have been oppressed by the boots of foreign occupiers for centuries on end, and finally, after so much bloodshed and lives were sacrificed, they finally achieved independence. The sun was finally shining upon the Balkans, or so they thought. You see, although Yugoslavia was out of the oven, the state that came out of it was half-baked at best. As I mentioned before, initially the Southern Slavs living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't really want independence. This idea only became popularized with the eruption of the First World War. As such, the ideas on how Yugoslavia would be structured and run were made up in a haste, practically in the last 3 years of the war. When they finally achieved independence, no one really knew the answer to the question, okay, what now? Sure, practically all these southern Slavs, minus the Bulgarians, were now in one state. But what was that state supposed to look like? The Slovenes envisioned a loose federation where everyone was free to do more or less what they wanted. The Croats were split between those who were a pro-strong Yugoslavia and others that wanted downright independence. The country was birthed prematurely, practically overnight, and there was a giant power vacuum left that no one really knew how to plug. Hell, worse yet, the country didn't even really have a safe environment to sit down and figure out what it wanted to be, as neighboring countries of Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary all had unfinished business with them and grave territorial ambitions. As such, in an effort to preserve its hardly fought out independence, Yugoslavia decided to just adopt the already existing institutions of the Serbian kingdom. Although at the time this seemed like the most logical and rational thing to do, it proved to be a grave mistake that would eat up the country from the inside. Although Yugoslavia was envisioned to be a state for all southern Slavs, irrespective of religion, gender, or sexuality, the copying and pasting of Serbian institutions practically made the new state just a greater Serbia. Great for the Serbs, not so much for everyone else. To vastly oversimplify this new government, the state's main legislative body was its National Assembly that was based on proportional electoral representation. Essentially, the ethnic groups that comprised Yugoslavia filled it with parties based on their ethnic composition. However, the National Assembly didn't have full legislative powers, but shared them with the king. At the same time, he was also the nation's head of the executive branch. And seeing that the Serbs were the majority in the kingdom, and one of their own was both the head of creating and passing laws, the balance of powers was tilted more towards one group. Also, although the nation had a new constitution, it definitely didn't help that the king was given the power to amend it. Almost immediately after its founding, the Yugoslav government entered a deep political crisis. Practically everyone had a different idea in which direction the country should go. Political parties like the Croatian Peasant Party were actively obstructing legislation from passing, while the prime minister was pushing pro-Serbian policy and challenging minorities, which all made the government enter essentially a standstill. At the same time, you also had an incredibly high level of distrust between these newly combined ethnic groups who were still influenced by the chaos of war, which just fueled the fire. And like today, electoral rigging and political violence executed by the police was more than prevalent. However, the ruling class was very much aware of this, and the parliament was doing its best to come to a compromise and found a state which the majority could get behind. Yet, just as they were close to achieving that, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the head of the Croatian Peasant Party in 1928 within the parliament. This event caused a national crisis and almost plunged the entire country into a civil war. In an attempt to evade the worst outcome, the king, Alexander, swiftly declared a dictatorship and took over the government fully. Under him, the country was renamed officially to Yugoslavia, and for the next couple of years, he would work tirelessly to implement new satisfactory Yugoslav institutions and pull out the country from sliding towards a civil war. His attempts, however, were ground to a halt when in 1934, during a diplomatic visit to France, he was assassinated by the IMRO, a Macedonian-Bulgarian nationalist secret society, which at the time was sponsored by the Croatian Ustasha. Following this, a campaign of Ustasha bombings across the country and terror killings ensued. While at the same time, Alexander's 11-year-old son, Petar, was declared king, but his uncle, Pavle, was made regent. With a lack of a strong central figure at the helm and geopolitical tensions only growing, the situation in Yugoslavia only became more dire. In 1939, the government again tried to cool down the situation and give the Croats more autonomy by restoring their parliament and effectively giving them their own government, which would only be accountable to the king and not the government in Belgrade. But instead of cooling off tensions, it just raised them more, as the Serbian nationalists found this act preposterous. By 1941, Yugoslavia was surrounded by hostile states on all sides. Germany was a ravaging hydra that had decimated Poland and France. Yugoslavia's allies seemed to be far and getting a beating of their lifetime. And a severely divided multicultural state like Yugoslavia that was struggling to industrialize and didn't have any impressive population stood no chance on its own against a vast enemy like Germany. So, in an effort to preserve its sovereignty, the government decided to sign the Tripartite Pact and ally itself with the Axis. Although to many this was a logical move, many others found this unacceptable, as historically, Germany has been one of Yugoslavia's greatest enemies, and anti-German sentiment was running wild. So a coup was launched where the king was replaced with Peter II, and the alliance with the Axis was renounced. But virtually just as that happened, Germany immediately invaded the country, bombing it to smithereens and occupying it alongside the Hungarians and Italians in a matter of 11 days. Following its capitulation, Yugoslavia was divided amongst the victors like a giant cake. Hungary was awarded Bajka, Italy, Montenegro, and Kosovo. Croatia was given independence, alongside Srem and Bosnia, alongside parts of Slovenia, while the Serbian heartland and Banat were annexed by Germany, and so, one of the darkest periods in the country's history ensued. With the establishment of the independent state of Croatia, the leader of the Ustasha, Ante Pavelić, returned from his exile in Italy and became the supreme leader of the state. Like many fascists of the time, Pavelić envisioned an ethnically pure Croatia. But seeing that Croatia at the time was only 51% Croatian, there was a lot of work to be done. In an effort to cleanse the state from the undesirables, programs of mass expulsion, mass conversion, and most brutal of all, mass murder were put into action. Throughout Croatia, concentration camps popped up where several hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Gypsies, and Jews would be placed and mercilessly tortured and murdered. Without going into gruesome detail, these camps saw pictures of mass starvation, sexual assault, stomach-turning torture, and systematic beatings. The worst of these was Jasenovac, where between 56,000 to 97,000 people were killed, while the second most infamous was Sisak, a concentration camp fully envisioned for children. The conditions and atrocities committed in these camps were so bad that high-up SS members and Italian generals that came to visit were sickened by what they found. Meanwhile, in Serbia, Montenegro, and parts of Bosnia, one of the first resistance movements arose led by Draža Mihailović. This resistance movement came to be known as the Chetniks. Overall, they were loyal to the king and envisioned a greater Serbia. As such, they initially fought all the occupiers and engaged in sabotage and assassinations. This, as a result, initially granted them the Allies' support. However, as time progressed, the Chetnik targeting of the Germans would be met with horrific consequences, as the Germans would implement the policy that for every dead German, 100 Serbian civilians would be executed. Not soon after, Draža's emergence, another resistance movement would also spawn. Led by Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslav communists would organize an army and form the Anti-Fascist Council for the Liberation of Yugoslavia, aka AVNOJ, or simply the Partisans. Unlike the Chetniks, the Partisans aimed for a unified Yugoslavia and not a greater Serbia, and had members from all walks of life and ethnicities. By the time of their emergence, the Chetniks would become sort of collaborationists with the occupying Axis forces due to their revenge policy and tone down their direct targeting of occupational forces. Also, although technically they were a resistance movement, the Chetniks targeted non-Serbs throughout Yugoslavia, such as the Bosniaks, which sullied their name and increased popularity for the Partisans. In contrast, the Partisans would continue to fight the Germans, Italians, Croatians, and Hungarians, regardless of the consequences. As a result, the two Yugoslav factions would clash against one another and a civil war emerged with the Chetniks and Partisans being at each other's throats. By 1943, the Allies would shift their support from the Chetniks to the Partisans due to their stauncher actions against the fascists, providing them with valuable intel and supplies when possible. The Partisans' tenacity only grew, as did their support, and by 1944, their number stood at 100,000. As the favor of the war started to shift, the Partisans were able to reconquer more and more territory and liberate Belgrade the same year in coordination with Soviet and Bulgarian forces. They were so effective in their resistance that, thanks to them, Yugoslavia is one of the few European states that have mostly liberated itself from Nazi occupation. By 1945, the Germans were completely driven out of the country solely by Tito with minimal Soviet support. The country was restored and the fascist scum had been dealt with. This, as a result, gave the communists in Yugoslavia tremendous support as well as Tito. And so, at the end of the year, the country held an election to establish a new government. Although, like with any elections right after the Second World War, these were heavily rigged in favor of the communists. They still amassed a great deal of support due to their actions during Yugoslavia's darkest hour. And although the war had ended, the nation was still embroiled in conflict. For starters, in the immediate years following the elections, thousands of people would be arrested and purged by the Yugoslavs. Some deserving, like the Ustasha collaborators, and others not so much, like the Banat Schwaben civilians. Attempts were also made to expand Yugoslavia's territory by attempting to annex Carinthia in Austria and Trieste in Italy, as well as the whole of Albania, which both the West and the USSR opposed. Hell, Yugoslavia was so fed up with everyone's bullshit that it even shot down an American plane flying over it in 1946. Then, in 1947, Tito tried yet again to expand Yugoslavia by signing an agreement with Bulgaria to form the Balkan Federation, only for it to be condemned by Stalin, which would have the project scrapped. Following this veto on Bulgaria joining Yugoslavia, Tito and Stalin would enter a clash that would end up resulting in the divergence of the two states politically. Tito would criticize Stalin for the looting and mass sexual assault Soviet troops committed on their way to help liberate Belgrade. Stalin would criticize Tito for supporting the Greek communists in their civil war. He'd also attempt to have Tito assassinated several times, and Tito would just send him a note saying to stop sending assassins. Otherwise, he'll send one and won't need to send a second. All in all, the conflict between the two became so great by 1948 that Yugoslavia was kicked out from the Communist Information Bureau and Soviet satellite states were ordered to blockade the country. But Tito wasn't really fazed and in return just purged the country of Moscow sympathizers and publicly proclaimed the USSR as imperialist. By the 1950s, Yugoslavia started to chill out a bit. Being isolated from the East, the country focused on its internal issues such as industrialization, pulling its economy from the dumps, and rebuilding itself from the war. Also, the country had a shift in its foreign policy, aiming to build closer ties with the West in an effort to access more capital and investment. Hell, after Stalin died, the USSR and Yugoslavia also made amends and the two started warming up to each other. But even so, Yugoslavia was determined to stay out of Moscow's grasp, and in the 60s called up leaders from all over the global south to Belgrade and founded the Non-Aligned movement, which aimed to give the middle finger to both the East and West. As the country was going its own way, it also heavily focused on building up its military. According to some sources, in this time period, the Yugoslav army was the fourth largest in the world. For about 20 years, things were running as fine as they could in a communist dictatorship. The standard of living in Yugoslavia was much better than that of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, but still worse than of that in the West. Although the economy was growing, so was inflation, as many of the policies implemented were unsustainable in the long term. Ethnic nationalism was severely suppressed, and discontent within the country was censored. Although far from a perfect country, Yugoslavia was relatively stable and provided a decent life for its citizens, unlike its neighboring communist states, and travel to the east and west was an enjoyable privilege to many. But then came the dreaded year 1980, when Tito died. Since Yugoslavia's second rendition, one of the core tenets of the government was the suppression of ethnic nationalism. Tito was a dictator, and although not as severe nor brutal as other dictators in the region, or the world for that matter, he still implemented autocratic policies. One of such policies was the censorship and suppression of regional nationalistic ideas and the promotion of pan-Slavic patriotism. As he didn't really make adequate institutions that would elect a successor after his demise, a power vacuum emerged that would be filled by leaders who would ride the decades-long suppressed ideas of nationalism and populism in an effort to secure popularity amongst the greater masses. One of the most notorious grifters at this time was Slobodan Milošević, who quickly rose to power during the late 80s by pushing Serbian nationalism. In a matter of years, Milošević quickly worked on dismantling Yugoslav institutions and centralizing power by making regional governments subservient to Belgrade. The breaking point of his policy was in 1989, when he initiated to amend the Yugoslav constitution, which would give Belgrade power over the other republics. As you can imagine, this did not sit well with the other states within Yugoslavia, most notably Croatia and Slovenia, who 2 years later declared independence from the country, which plunged Yugoslavia into essentially a decade-long crisis. Now, as this part of Yugoslav history is extremely complex, with every single side under the sun claiming events transpired a certain way, and no matter what I state here, someone will call me either a US aid functionary or Chetnik, or Ustasha sympathizer, or auto-chauvinist. I'll keep it brief and as objective as possible as I can. But for more information, please feel free to do your own research. With that in mind, at the same time as Milosevic came to power in Serbia, Croatia's man of the hour was Franjo Tudjman, who, like Milosevic, too was an ardent nationalist but of the Croatian flavor. Tudjman was not in favor of Croatia being subservient to Belgrade and propagated secession. However, as Croatia had a large Serbian minority, the Serbs there were opponents to being under independent Croatian jurisdiction and wished to be under Yugoslav, aka Serbian. Because the last time they were under an independent Croatia, things didn't go too well for them. Initially, fighting broke out in Slovenia as the Yugoslav National Army invaded and tried to subdue the breakaway state. However, upon Croatia seceding, the Yugoslav forces pulled out as there were practically very few Serbs living there, and Croatia was much more important in the eyes of Belgrade. Thus, from 1991 to 1995, Croatian and Yugoslav, basically now Serbian forces, fought against one another throughout Croatia. Although initially international support was somewhat split between the two factions due to Yugoslav brutality against civilians and cultural heritage like in the cities of Dubrovnik and Vukovar, the West almost unilaterally shifted support to Croatia's side. That's not to say that Croatia hadn't committed war crimes and ethnic cleansing against the Serbs, most notably with Operation Storm. Even though there's still an ongoing debate whether or not Operation Storm classifies as ethnic cleansing, it is certain that during it and after it, numerous crimes were committed to the Serbian civilians by Croat authorities as recorded by the UN. During the fighting between Serbs and Croats in 1992, Bosnia joined on the action and also decided to declare independence. As the republic was a mini Yugoslavia within Yugoslavia, with ethnic groups splattered all over the place like a Jackson Pollock painting, things almost immediately got messy. Bosnian Serb forces, with the backing of the Yugoslav army, quickly took control of almost 70% of the republic and enacted horrendous acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Bosniaks in an attempt to gain legitimacy for their territorial holdings. The worst of these actions was Srebrenica, where 8,000 Bosniak refugees were gunned down, an event that a large number of Serbs to this day contest. But again, it is necessary to mention that these acts of horror weren't committed by just one side. Croatia also got in on the action and attacked the Bosniaks attempting to secure ethnic Croatian lands. All three peoples enacted war crimes, acts of ethnic cleansing, and operated concentration camps that housed civilians and prisoners of war from the other sides. However, as the Serbian forces were the most powerful, they enacted these in the greatest quantity. As a result, NATO instigated a bombing campaign against the Bosnian Serb forces, which forced the three sides to the negotiating table and signed a peace treaty known as the Dayton Agreement, concluding the war in Bosnia. But a couple of years later, war yet again broke out in Kosovo when Milosevic attempted to subdue Kosovo by putting Serbs in position of power and severely limiting Albanians in any administrative positions. This posed protests and riots against the Serbian administration that were brutally suppressed, which only further escalated the situation as the Kosovo Albanians formed a militia known as the KLA, which would go on to commit acts of terrorism against both Serbian authorities and civilians. In return, Serbia engaged in mass ethnic cleansing of Albanians, which prompted NATO to intervene and start a 3-month bombing campaign, the results of which were for Serbia to capitulate and Kosovo to be taken over by the UN as a protectorate. But peace was still far from being achieved, as in the following years ethnic cleansing of Serbs and pogroms ensued that greatly reduced their numbers in Kosovo. Although the name of Yugoslavia persisted for a couple of years longer, in 2003 the country renamed itself to the Union of Serbia and Montenegro, but in 2006 Montenegro left the Union with a referendum and only Serbia was left. At the dawn of the millennium, the successor states struggled with privatization and corruption as numerous oligarchs sprang from the carcasses of Yugoslavia. Although ethnic tensions subsided, they never went away fully, as plenty still carry on in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia, and to a lesser degree in Montenegro and Croatia. Alongside them, historical revisionism blinded by nationalistic ideas still persists in virtually all the ex-republics. But their stories from the 21st century are for a different video. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like and subscribe button, and if you really did, become a member like these wonderful people. My name is Janusz, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.